welcome. Hello, welcome, and welcome to all our guest speakers and listeners this evening. Israel is writing one of the darkest pages in the history of genocides with Made in the West ink. These are the words of the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese. Francesca Albanese provided this chilling quote this morning when she said that for months we've witnessed a famine engineered in Gaza, a crisis manufactured not only by bombs, but by spreadsheets and statutes. While Israel systematically dismantles the infrastructure of life, bakeries, hospitals, and aid convoys, its Western allies have been dismantling the architecture of aid and solidarity. They defunded UNRWA, the lifeline for millions, leaving a deliberate void that cannot be replaced or filled. And as they sanction starvation, they silence dissent. The terrorist label, now being legally challenged in the UK, has become the West's catch-all justification, a tool to criminalize resistance in Palestine and solidarity everywhere. From student encampments to direct action, advocating for Palestinian life is being systemically reframed as extremism. Since when did solidarity become terrorism? When did students chanting for justice become extremists? When did sending aid to starving children become a crime? When did challenging state violence become grounds for erasure? The answer to this and other questions will be put to our guests, all of whom have been working on the issues of Palestine in their own unique way. I would like to introduce our guests, who will each speak for a short while with a few questions from me to highlight the problems we face and also to give some insight on what can be done to resist. And so to our first guest, Anas Mustafa of Cage International. He is the head of public advocacy at Cage International, an organization that has been fighting to highlight the chilling effect of terror laws for the past 20 years. Anas is the head of public advocacy at Cage UK, guiding media strategy and pioneering high-impact research and reports. He's a speaker and advocate against the abuse of state power, specializing across branches and breadth of UK terrorism law. Anas holds a degree in English language and he's native Arabic speaker and a student of Islamic studies. Welcome, Assalamu alaikum to you, Anas. Anas, I suppose the first question is, one of the things that we've been very keen to hear about is this application that Cage itself has made in relation to deprescription. Give us a little bit of background about what that is and what you're doing on it.
Thank you. So earlier this month, Cage submitted an application to the Home Secretary requesting that it deprescribes the Palestinian resistance organization, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, Hamas, from the list of proscribed organizations. Now, this wasn't the first attempt. There was a legal challenge by Hamas itself back in April rather, to request an appeal against his prescription. The basis this time has been slightly different. So Cage's application relies on a number of cases that we've been working on over the last 2 years since the genocide in Gaza has ensued. What we've monitored and what we've documented is the widespread use of counterterrorism powers to target and restrict, arrest, and silence the pro-Palestine movement here in the UK. And the sharp end of how this has been enacted is the use of terrorism laws and the fact that a major player in the Palestinian scene, which is Hamas, is prescribed, and hence any sort of solidarity with the Palestinian movement is interpreted as being solidarity with a prescribed organization. And therefore, we've seen widespread arrests, we've seen harsh police tactics against protesters, and we've seen that sort of bubbling away media narrative that the pro-Palestine movement in the UK is actually just a front for Hamas or spewing Hamas lines and so on. And this we've become very used to and sort of maybe even numb to as a result of how extensively it's been pushed across mainstream media. Now, what our application really just sets out very simply is that the prescription of Hamas inadvertently, or perhaps, as we would argue, intentionally, leads to the limitations or violations of the human rights of British citizens, essentially, especially when it comes to Article 10, Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which protect the right of free speech and protect the right of belief and conscience. And we've laid out a series of examples of cases. In the application itself is about 24, but in our casework, the cases are in the hundreds, literally. And these are examples where perhaps sometimes they are children, sometimes they're academics, sometimes they're engineers or doctors, professionals, sometimes they're professors and teachers who, due to their advocacy for Palestine, have faced consequences, disciplinary action, sometimes police intervention, sometimes their visas being revoked or being referred to counterterrorism, counter-extremism programs. And again, the pretext there that exists that enables this is the fact that pro-Palestinian activism is framed as something which is risky, something which is dangerous, something which is a threat to national security. And that can only ever happen because essentially the UK government has decided to prescribe the majority of actors resisting in Palestine. So that sets out our the CAGE's application, and we anticipate perhaps there's going to be a response to this application in the coming weeks. But the government has up to 90 days to respond. Now, in the application, just to list out some examples for
about some of the examples of what exactly it is that Cage is saying it's dealing with as circumstances. So please do explain some of those cases.
Yeah, definitely. So some of these examples, one of them is an example of an 8-year-old child. He is a child from Gaza. He has lost relatives in the current genocide. On a non-uniform day, he decided to dress in Palestinian colors. As a result, the school isolated the child. The school then contacted the parents and said that they are essentially making overt political sort of actions, essentially using their son as some sort of like vehicle to do so, and sent the child home. Now, the parents try to explain that rather the child here, he's not making any sort of political remarks. Rather, he's just expressing his own solidarity with his own people, and he's wearing his grief on his shoulders, quite literally. That wasn't accepted by the school. Fellow parents from that same school, they began to protest. Now, the school, instead of taking these concerns seriously and addressing the parents in a respectable manner, they decided to call in the police to deal with the parents. And it escalated further, such that the child was threatened with a prevent referral if the parents don't desist from their actions. Now, that's just one particular example impacting a child who his grief was interpreted as being an expression of some sort of extremist behavior. Another example that we have in our report is of a Turkish academic who had been working on the UK on a work visa and involved in some really specialist areas of research. He'd happened to be involved in some conversations, as we all are, on WhatsApp, and happened to share a document which was widely available across the media, where the Palestinian group Hamas explained some of its rationale behind its activities. Now, this document was uncovered due to a Schedule 7 stop. Now, I don't want to digress to talk about how Schedule 7 is a huge violation of due process norms and so on, but we'll leave it at that. And that was discovered to be on his phone. And as a result, they revoked his visa. And that meant he couldn't return back to the UK to work. And that's because he was deemed as a sort of his presence in the UK is no longer conducive to the public good, simply because someone is involved in some sort of, inquiry to learn and to understand what's taking place in one of the biggest conflicts that's ongoing currently right now. One last example is another professor, again a Palestinian, was teaching her class in a British university, and as part of in education around the Middle East, she presented her students with alternative points of view. So points of view from, let's say, pro and anti, and some of those pro views happen to align with some of the positions that many Palestinian factions, make. There were complaints, vexatious complaints, or vexatious complaints from certain students and certain lobbies within the university. And that led to that teacher, that professor, that academic being put on disciplinary procedures simply for academic inquiry. Now, these are just 3 examples of about 24 that are listed in the report, but they all follow the same pattern, where someone is advocating for the Palestinian cause. As a result, that is framed as an act of either extremism or terrorism, and following that of a process or a disciplinary process or police intervention or arrest, or worse, revocation of visas and so on, and sometimes perhaps even charges. And people are currently right now, they're facing charges for essentially, just sharing news of acts that acts that are taken in Gaza against the Israeli occupation forces. So that's why the application is very necessary. But these examples are perhaps they're very limited in scope. One of the main purposes of the application is really to broaden the public debate on Palestine and to not allow it to be so restricted and so narrow. And that's
describing there is a systemic way in which this is all taking place as well. That it's not just one thing; it's a number of different areas of activity, whether it's education, whether it's any of these areas that you've covered. That there is a systemic way in which the voice of an individual is being cautioned.
Exactly, and that's happening across the board. If for against the entire pro-Palestine movement. So really, the application is a litmus test for civil liberties here in the UK, and essentially putting it to the government and saying that your act of prescribing this particular organization has been done, it's politically motivated, and it's been done primarily to enable the targeting of an entire movement, and that's what we're seeing happening now. So it's not whether someone agrees or disagrees with Hamas, but it's really about how we defend the right to continue fighting for the rights of Palestinians.
I suppose one of the other points I want to make as well from this conversation is taking positives out of everything else as well. So in terms of what would you like to see the public do in relation to helping what Cage is doing right now, for example?
So a simple act that everyone can do right now is if you log onto Cage's website and go to Take Action tab, you'll find an action there that you can do to support the application to deprescribe Hamas. And there's a template letter there which you could write and send to your local MP, and to demand that they pressure the Home Office to take this application seriously and to apply pressure on the government to actually deprescribe the Hamas. I think that's a simple action that everyone can do. It'll take you just a few minutes to complete. More generally, of course, we need to all express and show solidarity with one another and continue to spread awareness and to speak openly and freely about these matters, and not to be cowed into silence. I think these are fundamentals that we should remind ourselves of often.
And Nas, thank you so much for your time there. I think that's something I am going to ask all of our guests, a small call to action as to what each individual group that is doing something can ask for the people that are watching this particular live cast to be able to do, because it is that issue of what is it that I can do that a lot of people often asking about this thing. Anas, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to our second guest. Our second guest is a member of Palestine Action, an organization we have all heard of, and has been in the news extremely, well, let's just say there has been a campaign in relation to how this organization has been portrayed. Saeed Shah, Saeed is familiar with, will be familiar to a lot of you that know about the shutdown of Teledyne Technologies in the UK. It's a supplier of F-35 parts that were sent to Israel. He will talk to us about Palestine Action and the recent decision that has been made by the Home Secretary, but primarily his own experience, because I think a lot of people don't understand what it's like to be a person that's in that particular organization, that's doing some of this work that they do. So Saeed Shah, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to you.
Hello, Wasif. Thank you for the invite. Great to be on.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about what Palestine Action are doing, what they're about, and give us a little bit of a flavor of what you did in relation to what happened to you.
So Palestine Action is a direct action network group disrupting and even dismantling Elbit, war factories, lots of different sites that provide weapons for Israel. Formed about 4 years ago, I think election started then from what I've seen on social media. And we've noticed a huge ramp up in the charges that we receive nowadays. I think we'll talk about that later. I want to talk about why I joined Palestine Action. So my first recollection of genocide in the Middle East is 1982, Sabra Shatila massacre. Now, I've been campaigning virtually since then. So we continue on till 2024, January. Israel get charged with genocide. I've signed lots of petitions. I signed 6 months worth of petitions, went on the marches, lobbied our MPs, and it was literally all ignored. So what that told me was that the democratic process had failed, because 80% of great British people, we just want ceasefire. We're a peaceful nation. We want a ceasefire. The government ignored us, which gave me a legal defense to take action to restore democracy and the people's will for peace. So that's one of the reasons I joined, because the petitions were being ignored. Another major reason we have to remember is UK complicity. If we're British, it was Britain that created Israel in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. So morally, we have more duty to be involved. This is not an international affair. We are not being world police. We are just policing our own government. It feels like we have to now. Obviously, Pal Action being a non-violent group, the best way. It's the only way. We don't have the right for violence here. Under Article UN 51, occupied people do, but we don't. So it's a non-violent group. It attracts a lot of people that way. So another thing that really inspired me about Palestine Action was, before I joined, they'd already shut down 3 Elbit sites. Okay, London, Tamworth, Oldham. They all made weapons or did admin to supply Israel with weapons. Those 3 sites were shut down by Pal Action, which means they'll never ever make weapons for apartheid or genocide again. I found that really inspiring, and honestly, I wanted a piece of that success. So I joined Palestine Action on the 1st of April, 2024.
And tell me, what exactly were some of the things that you did and that you got involved with? As I suppose anything obviously that's been published and that you can tell us about.
Yes, we could talk about everything that's public, as long as there's no contempt of court, which we never do. So the action we took was on the 2nd of April. That date, the reason I joined on the 1st of April was we received news that was the 2nd time the Israelis had decimated Al-Shifa hospital with drones, Hellfire missiles, which have components made in Britain. 1st of April, the Israelis also murdered 3 British aid workers, World Kitchen. The names are John, James, Jim. They were murdered by the Israeli forces. Rest in peace. They were going to come home the week after. So that's 1st of April. By then, we'd had enough. Everyone had had enough. So we took action on the 2nd of April. We snuck up to a war factory called Teledyne in Bradford, Shipley. Teledyne, Space and Defence. They make targeting and acquisition components, essential components for drones, killer drones in Israel. They make a huge amount of components for the surveillance, that awful surveillance that tracks every move. Teledyne also have the largest number of export licenses to Israel. Bear in mind, British law is clear. It's illegal for us to supply a country that's committing genocide. So that's another defense. So yeah, we snuck up on the factory. It's all public. We actually went through the fence with an angle grinder. We scaled the roof using a telescopic ladder. We stayed up on that roof. About 17 hours. We broke as many tiles on that roof as we could, because we knew every tile we break is breaking a link in the illegal supply of arms to Israel from our country. I went up there, it's part of my faith, as a Muslim as well. It's called tawakkul, make what effort we can and let the higher power decide, the outcomes. Also the duty as a Muslim to stand against oppression, and the amazing belief in Islam that if we save one life, it's equivalent to saving the whole of humanity. And inshallah, I think we definitely saved lives that day. So we stayed up there. Yeah, we did as much damage to the building. We were honest in court. We said that in front of the judge and the jury. And they said, why did you do so much damage? We said, because we wanted to halt production for as long as we could. Naturally, they charged us with criminal damage and trespass. We always plead not guilty. It's not trespass. We were not trespassing. We were there preventing the greater crime that Teledyne is committing by supplying a genocide. It wasn't criminal damage, not at all. It was intentional, strategic damage to the infrastructure of a factory that, once again, is supplying genocide. Yeah, our strategy was going to court, tell the truth, say it from the heart. The jury, they really felt our words, honestly. Sometimes they cried because of the desperation of the situation. Sometimes they laughed at CPS. And the jury did not convict us. Alhamdulillah, it was a hung jury massively in our favour, and we go back on retrial in February. Looking forward to it.
That's amazing. I mean, in terms of the fact that you were so honest as well, and it says something about the British legal system as well, doesn't it? I'll ask Frank this maybe later on, but the fact that you were so open and honest about what you have done, and the jury still found effectively a hung jury requiring a retrial, it says a lot about what people see and perceive as justice. I suppose one of the things I would like to really ask is, obviously there is this situation now with the prescription of Palestine Action. I mean, what are your feelings about that?
Honestly, I think it's ridiculous if we look at it. Okay, our charges were criminal damage, excuse me, and trespass. So we've had 4 UN special rapporteurs, the experts in the UN of human rights monitoring, and they've actually complained. They've said, look, PAL actions do not come anywhere near the thresholds of terrorism, which I agree with, because we're non-violent, we're unarmed, we make sure everybody is safe. No, I don't think any PAL action has ever been convicted of violence. So it's absolutely ridiculous if you look at the number of charges in between what we do. Look, there's things like firearms and assault, ABH, EBH. They're not terrorism. And there's no religious ideology.
Obviously, we have to be really clear about this as well. Palestine Action is its own organization, its own movement. There's no one person that necessarily speaks for that particular organization. So, it's not like all of a sudden Saeed Shah is speaking on behalf of Palestine Action itself. It's effectively, This is what's happened to you. This is your experience. This is what you're about. And this is what the situation is. Thank you so much. I mean, I think, we got so much from that in terms of what exactly it is that you've gone through. And again, I just make that very big point in relation to who represents Palestine Action in that particular instance. This is, like I said, an example in that sense. Thank you so much, Saeed. We're going to move on to our third speaker. Her name is Noor Faris. She's a Palestinian student activist who faced disciplinary action for speaking out in support of Palestinian resistance. Her experience has deepened her commitment to defend the rights of students to engage in political activism without academic retaliation. She is now actively involved with ASAP, Association for Student Activism for Palestine, where she works to support and advocate students facing institutional pushback due to their solidarity with Palestine. Assalamu alaikum, Noor.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Noor, tell us a little bit about what ASAP is doing and tell us a little bit about your own experience.
Okay, so I'll start off with my own experience when I was a student. So last year, when I was a student at King's College London, I was investigated under the charge of commission of a criminal offence under the guise of what they called moral support for a terrorist group, being Hamas. So I was president of the Palestinian Society at university, and we had a news series called Weekly Digest that we would publish every week as a summary of the events going on in Palestine. And this was something we had started way before October 7th. But following the events of October 7th, we published the Weekly Digest, and we referred to Al-Aqsa flood as carried out by resistance fighters instead of the term terrorists. And we also published a statement that reaffirmed Palestinians' rights to resist under international law. Now, this angered a lot of students and Zionists in the university who filed official complaints against us and caused the university to open an investigation. They hired an external investigator. They watched my every move, every social media post, every message that's been sent on our group chats, and they called us into disciplinary meetings and hearings for 4 months. And it was an incredibly difficult time because I was mourning the genocide of my people, and I had to deal with my university treating me like I was a threat. And I was also an international student, so I had my worries about my visa being revoked or not being able to finish my studies. But alhamdulillah, 4 months later, the terrorism charges were dropped. Eventually, the investigator they had hired claimed that our actions didn't fall into the threshold of terrorism laid out by the UK government. Yet even then, the university weren't fully convinced, so they slapped a couple of other misconducts on me, and one of them was hostile behavior, and they referred us to Prevent in an attempt to silence us and to keep us on the down low until we graduated. But it didn't succeed because as soon as the investigation lifted, I stepped straight back into activism. We launched the encampment at King's, and it stayed for over 2 months on campus grounds. But this isn't about me alone. It's about the broader climate of fear that they want students to face for expressing solidarity with Palestine. I would say that following October 7th, many universities were looking to each other to see how they reacted to their students so that they could follow in their footsteps. And my case was one of the earlier ones, but emboldened so many other universities to take disciplinary action against anyone who stands for Palestine. Now we're hearing of students being penalized by their universities left, right, and center. So yeah, in my work with ASAP now, that's what I'm seeing almost every day. We've seen, I think, hundreds of cases now, disciplinary cases, disciplinary action taken against their students for simply standing up with Palestine.
Well, one of the things that comes into play here is not just the actions of the universities themselves, but bad faith actors. For example, we know that UK Lawyers for Israel, Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, even Community Securities Trust, all of these organizations seem to have a lot of influence in writing to these particular institutions and forcing some of these actions where they shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I would also say the vagueness of it all plays a very important factor. So what they had accused me of was moral support, and that's not clearly defined legal standard. It's subjective, which allows it to be abused by these Zionists in power, like you mentioned, who want to punish us for simply standing with Palestine. And if you speak about the legal right to resist occupation under international law, is that now suddenly classified as moral support? And is that now an act of terrorism?
Indeed. And the way in which they are using effectively terrorism laws, but they don't necessarily have the qualification to do so. I know that there are cases as well with not just students, but even university lecturers where they've also been facing these particular types of problems.
Yes, absolutely. Especially at King's, I've heard of certain cases towards the lecturers, and it's part of the bigger picture where it's honestly, I would say it's aimed towards Muslims. It makes Muslims in particular vulnerable to surveillance and to disciplinary action, and we've seen this over and over again. You know, through policies like Prevent and anti-terror laws across the UK, as well as the war on terror against Muslims, which Cage have been fighting for over 2 decades now. But yeah, it's this bigger picture where they want to make supporting Palestinians as dangerous.
I suppose one of the things that I would ask as well is, what is some of the support that you would want? And I suppose a call of action for yourself. What would you want people to do that are out there listening to this right now?
I would say from the perspective of the student movement, the most important thing people can do is just continue to speak up unapologetically. And, you know, students must organize and escalate and continue to apply pressure to their complicit universities, because their universities are complicit in the genocide.
Indeed. From a legal point of view, I remember there's recently been a case where effectively the ability to have encampments has been severely restricted because of the fact that I think it's the University of Cardiff, they were able to obtain a long-standing injunction effectively for persons unknown. Do you think that the effect of some of these laws are now going to be more problematic now for you to kind of overcome? And would you stop doing the encampments, or do you think that you will continue doing the encampments regardless of this? In terms of encampments themselves, do you still have the foresight to want to continue doing encampments themselves?
I think encampments themselves are different. If students were to stop doing the encampments, it wouldn't be out of fear from these laws. I think it's just depending on the climate of the student movement. But yeah, I don't think the students, thankfully, we're not afraid. I mean, we've seen this happen over and over again, and they continue to slap a disciplinary action after suspension, and we continue to fight back, and we continue to speak up for what's right. So I don't think students are paralyzed by fear.
And I suppose one of the things as well that's coming into play is the higher education rights, the Act on free speech that is now being put forward as well, which potentially could help quite a lot in relation to talking about Palestine and saying what you want to say about Palestine in relation to even some of the organizations that may be prescribed, because of the fact that free speech is so important and valued.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is what happens when anti-terror laws are allowed to sort of creep into academics. I mean, the line between free speech and so-called moral support for a prescribed group becomes so blurred that even conversation becomes banned. So yeah, absolutely. The prescription of Hamas effectively bans discussion, and it allows the universities to punish their students for practicing their right to free speech.
Yeah. I suppose one of the other questions that I really would like to get from you is the feeling on campus right now. Are students scared, or are students feeling more emboldened in relation to some of the things that we are supporting them with? So, for example, organizations such as CAGE, organizations such as a number of different organizations that are out there that are providing this support. Do students feel secure? Do students feel safe?
I would say it's a bit of both. Unfortunately, the fear, you can't help but have the fear creep, and the fear of being investigated or misunderstood. But yeah, absolutely, with the support of organizations like CAGE and what we try to do as ASAP as well, absolutely, students feel emboldened. And this is a wider student movement. We've seen it across America as well, and in the UK. So a little bit of fear, unfortunately, but it's definitely the support has overcome that, and we feel very emboldened as student movement.
And one of the real problems that we do have is that what we find within this process of prosecution of students effectively is that they don't actually have a board that's legally qualified necessarily to undertake some of these prosecutions. We also know that a lot of the universities have their own policies that sometimes might be against what the Office for Students are putting forward or putting together. Have you seen that in terms of, have you seen discrepancies between universities that are very wide?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw that in my own case, actually. So the investigator that they had hired had said that, he couldn't find any ties to terrorism, but they said that that doesn't really absolve you of it because it was different to their laws within the university. So like I said, it's just the fact that it's so vague allows it to be misconstructed and abused towards pro-Palestinian students.
And what was just so that we're absolutely clear, what was the outcome of your particular case?
Oh, it was absolved, so no links to terrorism.
There you go. Excellent. Was there anything else that you wanted to necessarily say about the organization before I move on to our next speaker? Because I know that I'm giving everyone the opportunity today just really to make sure that they ask for whatever call for action that they want for people to do, because like I said, we're live right now, and this is going out to people that want to necessarily do something on the ground. So I would ask again, if there's any call of action that you have, let me know.
Just again, towards the students, just to organize, escalate, continue to apply pressure to the universities, make sure they divest from Israeli companies. And, this is the time for direct action.
Excellent. Noor, thank you so much for your time. That is a really, really engaging talk in terms of what you were doing and what you have done, and also your own experience. So thank you for that. My fourth guest tonight is Ahmed Jeddah. He is a starred Ahmed Jeddah, I should say, really. He's a graduate in economics and recently completed his master's in politics of the Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies. I'm reading this, but you know what? It should really be the School of Occidental and Aryan Studies, but that's another thing altogether. So basically, he has now studied classical Arabic abroad, and he has spent time learning from various scholars. Ustad Ahmed is also chief editor of The Muslim World, a Telegram-based news current and analysis channel, and he is currently the advocacy coordinator for human aid and advocacy. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to you, Ahmed.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.
Ahmed, I suppose, tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing in relation to what's been going on with these applications that have been going in for deprescription. Tell us a little bit about what you are also facing as an organization and as a charity. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. And before I talk about the impact that the prescription has had on the charity sector, I just want to take a few steps back and sort of set the stage, because genocide, it doesn't happen spontaneously. It happens in stages over the course of time. And, you know, in Palestine, and what we have seen here is that we're witness to a systemic process of genocide that span generations, not just years. You know, there's this scholar, a genocide scholar, his name is Gregory Stanton. He explains that there's 10 stages to a genocide. I'm not going to go through those stages. But what I want to mention is that he suggests that often these stages of a genocide, they occur in parallel and then they escalate. And I guess, well, from my summation, we're witnessing that escalation, that acceleration of a genocide that has been years in the making in Palestine. Now, genocide has many different tools. And the most obvious one is the military tool. The most visceral one is the use of the military, which we're seeing in Gaza at the moment, with the slaughter, the wholesale slaughter of men, women, and children. But there are other tools, like for example, the dehumanization of the Palestinians that happens over generations, the propaganda, the manipulation, the misframing that manufactures consent for the genocide. So, for example, the atrocity propaganda following the events of October the 7th, that kind of created this outrage, or this false outrage in relation to what actually happened. But the tool that I want to focus on, which is a very overlooked tool in the current genocide, is the weaponizing of laws, and to be more specifically, in this case, the prescription of Hamas, which has had an impact of restricting the ability of aid organizations like Humanitarian to operate in Gaza. So let me explain how that actually happens. And I mean, I don't need to tell our viewers about the extent of the atrocities that have been committed over the last nearly 2 years. I mean, the savagery and the depravity is beyond the pale. It's indescribable, whether it's the burning people alive in their tents, the bombing, the obliteration of the civil infrastructure, the shooting at starving people as they queue up for aid. All of this has led to an indescribable humanitarian catastrophe. And that has meant that we desperately need direct, unimpeded humanitarian access to deal with this. And it's absolute necessity at this point. However, the prescription of Hamas has made it almost impossible, very, very difficult to coordinate, because the civil infrastructure, the governing body of Gaza, is Hamas. They oversee everything. They control everything, whether there's health or sanitation, education, the registry systems, everything, because they are the governing civil administration of the Gaza Strip. So without an ability to interface with these structures, even indirectly, humanitarian actors and charities are left paralyzed or severely impeded. Now, the point that I just made was made in the Houses of Parliament, in the House of Commons, by, for example, now I'm just going to quote this now, by Alan Smith, a member of Parliament. He said, and I quote, "The reality in Gaza especially is that Hamas is a fact of life. You cannot get anything done. You cannot get aid delivered. You cannot have medical projects. You cannot have civil society dialogue without Hamas's active involvement one way or another. I do not say that as a matter of anything to be glad. I do not say that as a matter to be glad about, but it is the reality. How will this listing impact the NGOs trying to promote dialogue and civil society and trying to deliver humanitarian aid? Anything that would limit their activities or curtail their active involvement is a retrograde step. End quote. He also said, we must remember what is at stake. These humanitarian principles matter for every conflict around the world. They should be applied consistently in every war zone. As we have said repeatedly, humanitarian aid must never be used as a political tool. That's him, end quote. Now, the point being, the continued prescription of Hamas during a time when the population of Gaza are facing starvation and facing extermination is a huge obstacle for aid organizations which are simply trying to save lives. That's all they're trying to do. And the law is effectively exacerbating the suffering, the death of Palestinians in a moment of genocide. So charities like Humanitarian Advocacy and others that are on the ground now have to go through this really rigorous sort of due diligence process, explicitly asserting that we have no involvement with Hamas. Of course, we don't. But because of all of this red tape, because of all of these restrictions, as I mentioned earlier, funds are stopped from their optimal use. These restrictions aren't merely bureaucratic, they cost lives. That's the key point I want to make. And despite all of, and this is another key point I'd like to mention here, despite the due diligence that charities take in making sure that we are compliant, as we all are, despite all of that, this law leaves charities vulnerable to malicious attacks and suspicions and all kinds of problems, which averts many others from actually engaging in Gaza. So, as a way of example, the British charity Save One Life, which is currently now being investigated over allegations that the money it raises for families and for the poor and the weak in Gaza ends up in the hands of Hamas. You see, these laws not only impede the humanitarian access, but they also are used or weaponized against charities that are simply trying to go there and trying to save lives. Bad actors are using that to create allegations or dispersions against other groups. And it's for that reason, and I've been speaking for some time, but if I may, it's for that reason why Human Aid and Advocacy here, we support this application to deprescribe Hamas. Why? Because it is the government's obligation to uphold humanitarian access and the rule of law. And the government has a legal and moral duty to safeguard humanitarian spaces, especially in a moment of genocide. So it's not a matter of politics. It really isn't. It's a principle of necessity. You know, the United Nations humanitarian chief, he said that people in Gaza are being subjected to forced starvation. The human rights bodies, international human rights bodies, genocide scholars are all saying the same thing about this being a genocide. So it's not a time for political posturing. It's a time for moral clarity. It's a time for the UK government has shown some courage, because the deprescription of Hamas is not just a procedural matter. It really isn't. It is life or death for thousands of people, for countless civilians, and it's a critical step to restoring the integrity of humanitarian law in British politics.
I suppose, Ahmed, I mean, that's a really powerful statement. And I think everyone on this call is beyond, and everyone that's probably watching that supports the organizations that are on this call, we're beyond thinking about whether or not this is a genocide or not. We know it is a genocide. I think that's the point.
Yep.
And further, I suppose it's, like you said, a staged and structural process. I mean, we've removed one of the main issues in relation to how aid was delivered into Gaza through UNRWA. So that organization is removed, and now there's a free-for-all. What is the next stage? It's the dehumanization of those particular populations. So, you know, whether it's, you're talking about Radio Rwanda, where people are being described as effectively, you know, cockroaches. You're dehumanizing these people to such an extent that it becomes justifiable to do what we have seen being done. So that's from an advocacy perspective. And then on top of that, you've got the actual barriers in place for charities, especially in the UK, to be able to provide funds. So I do know, for example, you have to get a license through OFSI, you have to have a process through OFAC if it's the United States, where basically there has to be a named person that then says, I'm not part of Hamas or something else like that. But by the same token, how do you really distinguish? How can you make that particular point when the ruling government, which has been elected, and let's not forget, is unable to kind of have any conversation or discussion? So it really is a case of being one-sided in relation to whether or not someone decides, yes, we will allow you to give aid to this particular person in order to distribute or not. And that's one of the problems that charities are facing on the ground. I think a lot of charities right now are facing that particular problem of who is my contact in Gaza to be able to get funds in, to be able to get goods in. And then on top of that, you have an overarching authority such as the Charities Commission, which effectively you can't really say anything else against, because there's a small way in which you can effectively challenge the Charities Commission through Section 115 of the Charities Act. But effectively, what you have is this space where this organization also is vetting you for what you're saying and how you're going about producing funds or collecting funds here, even in the UK. Have you had that kind of issue in terms of other charities and how you have been approached by the Charities Commission? Is there anything to be said about that?
When working in places like Gaza, which have been highly politicized, of course, there's going to be extra scrutiny from the Charity Commission, but not just from the Charity Commission. You have outside forces that put pressure on the Charity Commission because it's with, as I said, there are many tools to a genocide. And one of the tools is by removing those that are trying to actually provide humanitarian assistance or make sure that their job is as difficult as possible. So there are organizations that are perhaps supportive of Israel, that are lobbying for Israel, that have a lot of power to actually put pressure on organizations like the Charity Commission to scrutinize or to look at our work and see if they can actually find any discrepancies. Which is to say, we have to be vigilant and we have to show due diligence, which we certainly do. But it does, it does make life.
Recently, that came out in relation to the UKLFI being one of those organisations. So there's a cage report on that, and some of the ways in which influence is effectively not as transparent as it should be in relation to what exactly happens with these organisations thereafter. And that was through freedom of information requests, and so it's a fully authored report.
Right.
But I'm assuming that's what you mean in terms of bad faith actors also being involved in this whole process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I suppose from my perspective, I want again to give you an opportunity for a call to action in terms of what you would like to see the general public do, and how you'd like to approach this particular situation.
Well, at Humanitarian Advocacy, I mean, it's in the name. We don't just provide humanitarian aid, but we also engage in advocacy. I feel that that's a necessity for charity, not just to be within the humanitarian area, but to actually try and change or challenge the systems of oppression. Now, we have, and we are going to release publicly a document that's called Awareness to Action, and it will be on our website very, very soon. And what it does is gives the public a step-by-step guide on how every individual can be an advocate. Often I find many people speaking to me saying, look, what's happening is terrible, but I don't know what to do about it. Right? What can I do as an individual? I'm stuck here in the West. How can I possibly help? So this is really a response to that. It's it's effectively so there are 4 avenues that we're calling people towards. There are many others, but we're trying to make it simple and saying, okay, if you don't know what to do, here are 4 avenues. One being how to use social media effectively. The other one being how to lobby mainstream media for its biased coverage effectively. Number 3, how to boycott effectively, strategically. And number 4, how to lobby MPs, again, strategic. So what we have done is, because people are doing that, but what we want is for people to do it in a more intelligent, more strategic, more coordinated manner, so that the impact that we have is going to be much more more impactful. So I am actually presenting this in various mosques across London at the moment, but the actual document or the guidance for what people can do individually and collectively will be on our website very soon. It's called Awareness to Action, inshallah. So once it does drop, we will be informing people of that.
Okay, Ahmed, thank you so much for your time today. We are going to move on to our next speaker very quickly, because I'm realizing that we have a shortage of time as well. But before I do that, Saeed Shah, I'd just like to come back to you, because I don't think I got your call to action. So I got you to speak so eloquently about everything that you've gone through, but I didn't get to see your call to action. And I know you have one, so I'll give you the floor for a few minutes just before I go to our next speaker.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, the call to action, please, is to support our Filton 18. They have spurious charges, in my opinion, of suspected terror links. That's what the charge has been put on. In my opinion, it's completely false. Please follow them on Insta at Free the Filton 18 and come down to their next hearing at Woolwich Crown Court this June the 30th and 1st of July. Thank you, guys.
Excellent. So I will now move on to our next speaker. My fifth guest needs no introduction, to be honest with you. He is Dr. Azam Tamimi, an outspoken and well-known British Palestinian academic and political activist. He writes and lectures on issues relating to Islamic political thought and Middle Eastern politics. Dr. Tamimi received his BSc in Combined Sciences from the University of Sunderland in 1979, before completing a PhD in political theory from the University of Westminster in 1998. He is currently the chairman and editor-in-chief of Al-Hiwar TV channel. He has been visiting professor at Kyoto University and Nagoya University since 2006. He makes regular television appearances for both English language and Arabic media outlets such as Al Jazeera and Press TV, and frequently publishes opinion pieces in The Guardian and other newspapers. Dr. Tamimi is the author of several books on Middle Eastern and Islamic politics, including Hamas, Unwritten Chapters, Rashid Ghanouchi, A Democrat Within Islamism. He's also authored a report as expert evidence accompanying the first application that was filed to deprescribe Hamas by Riverway Law in April 2025. His paper is entitled Report on the Ideology, Aim and Objectives of Hamas as Reflected in its Charter and Pursuit of Peace. Dr. Azam, welcome. Salam alaikum to you.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
There are so many things that we could ask you about and to speak on and to give your opinion on, but I'd really like to focus this around the issue of the application for deprescription that's been made, because I think you gave an expert report in that particular instance, and I would like to expand what you actually said about that so that people understand what is in that report, and they can actually go and see it online as well.
Well, really what I wanted to do is inform people about Hamas, about its origin, its raison d'être, its ideology, to just show them that had Hamas been an organization fighting against Nazi occupation in one of the European countries, they would have been considered heroes today. So it's a resistance movement, no more, no less. And it helps to understand the history of the movement. And probably what I wrote for the application sums up what my research was about for my book Hamas Unwritten Chapters. And once people understand the roots and the ideology and the raison d'être of this movement, they will come to the conclusion that the British government's decision to proscribe it was highly political and not founded on facts, biased, because the former Home Secretary who took that initiative upon herself was actually scandalously exposed for having intimate relations with a number of senior Israeli officials and was sacked from her own job at one case, well, at one instant, because she went on a private holiday, but ended up holding meetings with these Israeli officials.
I suppose one of the issues is in relation to the politicization of this particular, this use of anti-terror laws, and we can come to Frank a little bit later in relation to that as well. But in relation to some of the things that we saw, and when I was reading the application, things that weren't clear before became a lot clearer, such as, for example, the charter that Hamas had from 1988 versus the charter that's from 2017. These kind of subtle differences that then became very big and obvious points that have been clarified now. Is it possible you could give us a little bit more information in relation to those things?
Yes, it is important, of course, to explain to people the story of the charter, because it is frequently quoted by pro-Israel activists, by Zionists, to prove that Hamas is this or that, to defame it and to give it really a very bad image or a very bad name. The charter that was published in 1988 was actually written when the majority of the top leaders of the movement had already been detained by the Israelis. So it was a one-man initiative and written in a language and in a conception that represented the prevalent thinking of that era. And since then, Hamas has come a long way. Actually, the charter itself was never quoted by Hamas officials. In many of their declared statements, they actually expressed views that went against that charter, including Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Khalid Mish'al, Rantisi, and many others. And then in 2017, Hamas came with a political statement that really, in my opinion, fell short of canceling the first charter. My own view, as I explain it in the book, is that the original charter, the 1988 charter, was not good. It was harmful for Hamas. It was harmful to Hamas. It didn't serve its cause. And the 2017 political document was an improvement, but not sufficiently. But nevertheless, it is the declared positions and statements of the leading figures within the movement that really matter, in which they clearly talk about this conflict as being a political conflict that is the result of an illegal occupation, that they struggle for the liberation of their homeland and for the freedom of their people, that they don't consider the Jews to be the enemies. Only Zionists who occupy our land are our enemies, and that we lived with the Christians and the Jews for more than 1,000 years in peace and harmony, and that Zionism itself is a European invention and was an attempt to solve the European Jewish problem rather than the Muslim Jewish problem, because actually the Muslims never had a problem, never had a Jewish problem. It was the Europeans, and the response to that problem was provoking this idea. It was anti-Semitism, which resulted in the formation of Zionism.
Indeed, I suppose the history is so important, because we hear about, obviously everyone now knows about the Balfour Declaration and all those kinds of issues, but the kind of intricacies and the details of the late 80s and the following on from 1967 effectively, that becomes a little bit more blurry, because it's not as, I suppose, sexy in terms of what people are talking about, how people are talking about, and they seem to lose the fact that there was this important change in this organization over that period of time as well. In terms of the politicization, though, in terms of what the act has been in regards to the laws in this country, I mean, how do you feel, for example, in relation to Palestine Action, that's recently, we know that the Home Secretary is seeking to prescribe them. How do you feel about that? Not just as an academic, but as a Palestinian yourself?
Well, first of all, the British government's bias toward Israel and toward Zionism and all the attempts they make in order to protect Israel politically and diplomatically, as well as provide it with the means of supremacy over the Palestinians, drives people to desperate acts. Because when the democratic avenues no longer work, when human rights are no longer respected, and when the civil liberties are being curtailed by various authorities in this country, people start thinking differently. And therefore, the government, in dealing with such phenomena, should first call its own self to account. It should look inwards and revise whatever policies it is adopting. But see, there are some very positive signs one can see in this society, in the British society, as well as in the world as a whole. And that is that the young generation is a lot more interested in educating themselves about the root of the conflict and about the history of this cause. And they are coming out very courageously, boldly, defying the authorities, whether they are the political authorities or the academic authorities. And I think this is a brilliant development, because this is similar to what happened in the case of the Vietnam, in the case of the Vietnam War, as well as in the case of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. It was these young students, these young men and women, who eventually brought about the change. And I think in a few years' time, the seat that is occupied today by the likes of Starmer and his various members of cabinet will likely be occupied by the students who today are trying from within their own campuses to enlighten the rest of society about the danger of Zionism to humanity.
Indeed, I suppose this issue as well, I mean, the power of arrest itself as a form of protest, and the way in which people see Gaza, it seems to circulate because it resonates. So the issue of Gaza is because someone else through a colonial project has got links of thought processes that, you know what, this happened to my people at some point, or this happened to my people at some point. And so that issue is it's almost centered around Palestine as being like a microcosm for everyone else as well. I did want to get Noor's final thoughts as well, but she's just had to leave us, I think. But that concept and that idea of why Palestine seems to resonate so much with the rest of the world. Is there any other thoughts in relation to that?
Well, Palestine and Gaza in particular is exposing the hypocrisy of the world order under which we have been living. This world order that promised a better world, that promised to protect people's liberties and rights, is turning to be a mirage. And I think this is all because of the struggle of the people of Palestine, that an increasing number of people, especially the young generation, as I mentioned earlier, are opening their eyes to the fact that this world order needs to be changed. And future generations, future historians, when they write about the era in which we live today, will most likely credit the Palestinians and their supporters for the coup against a very unjust world order.
And if there was a call to action that you could bring, that you could say to people, I mean, you've mentioned in positive terms the youth and how the youth are taking on board particular issues, but if there was something that you could say more in relation to what people could do that are listening here today, what would that be?
I think it's very important to start with educating oneself, learning more, read more about this. And there are plenty of material, of books, of a lot of material that one can access. And then one should look to oneself. What is it that I can do? If I am a good writer, then I'll write. If I am a good speaker, then I'll speak. If I am a good communicator, then I'll communicate with others. We need to educate the public. We need to speak to our comrades, to our friends, to our neighbors, to our workmates, university mates or schoolmates, etc. And I think every one of us has something within himself or herself that might enable them to contribute to the change required. So each of us should look onwards to see what is it that we can do and should do.
Dr. Azam Tamimi, thank you so much for your contribution. It's been absolutely enlightening. And again, the message I'm sure has hit home for a lot of people, not only because of your academia, but also because of the fact that you are Palestinian and you bring that passion to everything that you say. So thank you for that. My final guest this evening is a shrinking violet, I'm sure, you know. He's a person that needs a little introduction as well. I have had the pleasure of working with Frank on important cases, but his fire and passion for justice is what has got so many people to look up and notice what a special talent we have at the bar. And I don't mean the drinking one. Frank McGuinness is a barrister practicing in public, civil and criminal defence. His work centres on challenging rights, breaches by the British state and other states, employers and landlords. He has expertise in legal claims representing Palestinian and anti-Zionists who challenge Israeli colonialism and apartheid. He is currently acting for a number of people who've been dragged in front of their professional regulators, fired or otherwise victimised for expressing anti-Zionist political opinion. His practice spans asylum and immigration, public law, housing, employment and industrial relations, civil action against public authorities, inquests, criminal defence, prison law and international law. Welcome, Comrade Frank.
Thank you, Asif. It's great to be here. And thank you, Cage, for creating this space. It's an honor, as always, and a privilege to share this platform with such wonderful friends and comrades. As Wasif said in his introduction, I'm a barrister now practicing in England and Wales, but I'm originally from the occupied north of Ireland. And I would say that I came to my pro-Palestinian politics, my anti-capitalist politics, through the Irish Republican struggle. And as is often my practice at moments like this, I want to stay connected with how people on this call and this meeting might be feeling at what's truly a very terrifying time, not just for the people of Palestine as they continue to face genocide, but also the anxiety that we must all be feeling at the outrageous, illegal war that the Zionist entity, with the backing of the United States, has waged on Iran. So I think it's important for us to sit with how we're feeling, because I'm here to try to encourage people to face our fear. It's okay to feel afraid at a moment like this. It's okay to feel afraid if you're in Britain and you see your increasingly authoritarian government trying to attack the cutting edge of Palestine solidarity. But fear is, the things that scare us are put on this earth to test us, and our courage is forged in opposition to those things. So it's, as I've said many times before, I really believe that courage is something that we cultivate collectively. If you remember when you were in school, if you ever got into trouble, like I did, I used to get into trouble. Once I got into trouble for posting stuff about the IRA on a school computer, and I was in trouble by myself because no one else had done that with me. That was my cross to bear. But on other occasions, I would get in trouble with even just one other person, and it just felt so much less burdensome to know that there was someone there with you, and then you would laugh afterwards. And I'm really here to suggest that we win this struggle together, and we develop courage and sumud together. And I know that I've personally learned so much from Palestinians. I'm not trying to fetishize them, but I just seeing what some of those people have had to go through has taught me so much about what humans are capable of. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the Terrorism Act 2000, its use against Palestinian groups, as well as its use against British-based groups like Palestine Action. And then I'm going to talk, as has been the thread running through all of this, I'm going to talk about a call to action. What can we do? So I'm going to start by pointing out that we can't understand the Terrorism Act 2000 without understanding its precursor legislation and the context in which it emerged in the occupied north of Ireland, where I come from. So in that context, think about the history of the so-called Troubles that really emerged in the late 60s because the British Empire's oldest colony in Ireland had violent hostility towards the indigenous Catholic population. And in the late 60s, loyalist gangs were burning Catholics out of their homes with the connivance, the active participation of the sort of statelet, the loyalist statelet in the north of Ireland. So that's the context in which the Provisional IRA and other groups emerged, right? They were primarily community defense groups to begin with. And it took several years before the IRA first planted a bomb in Britain, all right? So to begin with, they were community defense, and they struggled with legitimacy. A lot of people said, look, this is violent. There was a peaceful Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, was the sort of what the non-violent alternative to the armed force tradition. And then in 1972, infamously, the British Army, the Parachute Regiment, attacked a peaceful civil rights march, right? A march that was a movement that was expressly inspired by the Black civil rights struggle in the United States of America, so-called. And the British Army attacked it with machine guns and murdered 14 people in cold blood. And after 1972, people flooded into the Provisional IRA and other Republican groups like the Irish National Liberation Army. That was my father's generation. Obviously, people were being shot dead in the streets, and people thought, some Catholic people, some Irish people thought, I'm not gonna let them murder us in the streets. We're gonna do something about this. That's where the IRA came from. And so that posed a problem for the British state, because they had this extremely sophisticated national liberation struggle, not dissimilar to the Black struggle in the US. It had a kind of peaceful civil rights wing, like Martin Luther King and so on. And then it had its armed wing, like more militant tactics. And so the British state developed this emergency legislation and developed this technique, among many other techniques. One of the techniques they developed was to designate the organizations they didn't like terrorist organization. And then the primary effect that had was that membership of the organization attracted a 10-year prison sentence. And that meant that you could the British state could lock up its political and military opponents like on a whim. And this, of course, in the context of the removal of jury trials from the north of Ireland, right? So-called Diplock courts. Lord Diplock realized that, look, if you get 3 Catholics on a jury, they're not going to convict someone accused of being an IRA member. So they just got rid of juries, all right? So that's the context. That's where the precursor legislation comes from. And then it gets consolidated in the Terrorism Act 2000 to apply far beyond the territory of Britain and Ireland. And that's what we see in a case like Hamas, right? There's no suggestion that Hamas operates in Britain. But just dwelling on the history, I don't want to overstate the Irish connection, but I suppose it's one with which I'm very familiar, and I do think it tells us something quite deep about what's happening here. There used to be a policy or a convention, which was that the British Empire would distinguish between the political non-military wing and an armed wing of an organization. So the non-military political wing wouldn't be prescribed. And it's the case that the British government considered banning Sinn Féin, which was the political wing of the Provisional IRA, after the IRA bombed Harrods in London in December 1983. And 6 people were killed in that bombing. So despite that violence, on British soil, on the British mainland, in London itself, the British state still observed that convention. And this is 1983, the height of the Troubles. They still observed that convention, and they didn't prescribe the political wing of the IRA. Fast forward to today, we have peace in the north of Ireland, right? The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 led to a peaceful resolution because Irish Republicans could see some kind of route to a united Ireland that didn't require armed struggle. And I'm not here to uncritically endorse the Good Friday Agreement, but broadly it's the case that my homeland is much more peaceful today than it was when I was a kid growing up, and certainly than it was in my father's generation. Now, some of you may know that I'm instructed by Hamas, right, the Islamic Resistance Movement. They've made an application under Section 4 of the Terrorism Act 2000. The British state used to observe that distinction between the political and the military wing of Hamas. And then in 2021, the politically compromised figure, Priti Patel, decided to get rid of that distinction, and she prescribed the entire organization. Now, in that application, 20 experts submitted reports supporting it, including such luminaries as Professor Avi Shleim, the anti-Zionist Jewish historian now of Oxford, formerly of Palestine. And one of those experts is a man called Dr. Tristan Dunning, who's an expert on Hamas. And in his report, he said at paragraph 14, quote, historically, Hamas had made a clear distinction between the movement overall and the Qassam brigades. This is hardly unique to Hamas and analogous with Sinn Féin, which had elected members in Westminster even during times of conflict and the Provisional Irish Republican Army. Until recent years, this distinction had been upheld by the United Kingdom and Australia, among others. It is unclear what prompted these changes in the early 2020s, end quote. So the British state has thrown that convention out the window and has said we're going to treat the entirety of Hamas as if they are terrorists, according to the extremely broad definition of terrorism that comes to us from Section 1 of the 2000 Act. And I'm going to suggest, as I have done previously, that in doing that, by making that deprescription decision, they have endorsed, the British government has endorsed the very logic of the genocide in which the British Empire stands accused not of mere complicity, but of active participation, right? It's provably the case that the British Empire is participating in the genocide of Palestinians. It's not just that Keir Starmer seemingly committed a war crime on camera by upholding Israel's apparent right to engage in collective punishment of Palestinians, but it's that they're, in all kinds of ways, including by this prescription decision, making it so that Palestinians are viewed as fair targets, no matter who they are, whether they're children, they're all deemed guilty. That genocidal logic was clearly articulated, right? The so-called Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, was quoted in the International Court of Justice judgment from January last year in the South Africa genocide case. And Isaac Herzog said, quote, "It is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It is absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat," end quote. So he's talking about Hamas and he's saying because the people of Gaza voted for them, didn't overthrow them in a coup d'etat, that means, quote, an entire nation out there is responsible. Not just people in Gaza, the entire Palestinian nation is responsible, all right? So that's the logic that the British state has endorsed. We know that from its military, diplomatic, economic participation in the genocide, but we also know it from the prescription decision. It's based on the same logic. Palestinians are all fair targets. They're to be obliterated. They're to be the subject of a genocide because Britain's little loyal Jewish ulster agrees with Netanyahu and co that Palestinians are some kind of racial threat to be solved with obscene genocidal violence. I'm going to think briefly about another former British colony, South Africa.
Just before you go into that as well, just because one of the things that when I read that application as well, one of the things that came out from there was actually mechanisms that had been put in place to allow for something that similarly happened in Northern Ireland to actually take place potentially in Gaza too. It's something around how they may have a long-term goal and a short-term goal. Could you just perhaps expand on that a little bit?
Do you mean that they're seeking to put in place some kind of
understanding that we can live with the 1967 borders, but by the same token, we don't give up our entire claim to the land of Palestine either. That's that being a similar point to how Ireland is viewed in terms of Irish Republicans, so to speak.
Absolutely. I think there are lots of analogies with the Palestinian struggle, Algeria, South Africa, Vietnam. Like we learned something, even the struggle against Jim Crow laws in the US, right? There's lots of very useful examples that Palestinians can draw from. And I think the Irish example, like any analogy, has its helpful elements and its unhelpful elements. I think the scale of violence in Ireland, obviously we had the Irish famine and so on, but that was 1845 for between 4 and 6 years, depending on who you ask. So there was a genocidal level of violence in Ireland, but it was back in the 19th century. And then the Troubles was what's sometimes called a low intensity conflict. So the big difference is that the scale of the slaughter in Palestine is staggering, much higher than anything that Irish people experienced these last 2 centuries. And but what's helpful is that it's 2 states, right? Ireland has been cut in half by this imperial colonizer, just like Palestine has been cut in half by the same literal British imperial colonizer. So I do think that's helpful. And I do think that sometimes we get criticized, don't we, for obsessing over the Jewish state and all this. Like, why are you so obsessed with Palestine? Are there any other states that you think should be abolished? And the obvious answer when speaking to an Irish Republican from South Armagh is that, yeah, I don't think there should be 2 Irelands. I think there should be a one-state solution, if you will, in Ireland, just like there should in Palestine. And then the South African example, I mean, in some ways, what's troubling about the South African example is that apartheid never really came to an end as a matter of economics. I mean, I think important steps were made. I'm not trying to dismiss the important struggle that culminated in 1994 and the collapse of the apartheid regime, but the economic logic is still there. And we do have to be very cautious compared to something like Algeria, which was a much more equal country because there was a much more systematic military defeat of the French colonizers. That never really happened in South Africa, and it's a cautionary tale, in my opinion. Coming back to Mandela briefly then, sticking with South Africa, I just want to point out, because I'm going to come to Palestine Action in a second, I'm conscious of not taking up too much time, but when Mandela died in December 2013, David Cameron, who was the prime minister at the time, described him as, quote, a towering figure in our lifetime, a pivotal figure in the history of South Africa and the world, and it is right that we meet in this parliament to pay tribute to his character, his achievements, and his legacy, end quote. But during Thatcher's time in office, right, same party, Conservative Party, members of the Federation of Conservative Students went as far as wearing stickers declaring "Hang Nelson Mandela," which was, of course, what the South African apartheid government had sought to do at the Rivonia trial, right? They sought his execution. And the head of that Federation of Conservative Students at the time, John Bercow, of course, went on to become the Speaker of the House of Commons. And Cameron visited apartheid South Africa in 1989 when he was 23 on an all-expenses-paid fact-finding mission, so-called, funded by Strategy Network International, which was a lobbying group seeking to lift sanctions against the apartheid regime. So what I say we know from that is that David Cameron is a spineless coward and a deeply racist individual who lacks integrity. I might have thought slightly more of him if he had at least said, well, fair play to him. He overturned apartheid, but I supported apartheid to the hilt when it actually mattered. But he's not got that integrity or that clarity. And so he pretends to pay tribute to a man who in reality was being oppressed by an apartheid regime that David Cameron supported when it mattered. All right. So that tells us something about the kind of moral, the lack of moral integrity of the people that we're dealing with in the British Empire. What about Lammy and Starmer, right? The current day equivalent of Cameron. Starmer, of course, the prime minister. I think they'll be remembered in similar terms. No doubt when Palestine is liberated entirely from Zionism from the river to the sea, these politicians will at that point pretend to have supported the emergence of what sometimes referred to as the Palestinian Mandela, right? Some kind of unifying figure who can forge a single democratic Palestinian state. But when it mattered, right now, they willfully participated in genocide for 20 months and counting. So Starmer, Lammy and co are racist liars. They have no credibility. Their moral and political authority is collapsing. It's in complete freefall. They are, in my opinion, pathetic, sniveling little wretches. They lick the boots of the US empire that obviously and openly dominates British foreign policy. And the lions, the comrades in Palestine Action, are moral giants by comparison. Next to these pathetic administrators of an empire in decline. So these British imperialist bootlickers are trying to prescribe the cutting edge of Palestine solidarity in Britain. Of course they are. They're racist imperialists. Their hands are drenched in Palestinian blood. But us on this call, you listening to me, whoever might be listening to this right now, you can do something to resist them. And that's what we've been here to think about. What can we do to resist? So I have 3 tentative observations in that regard. Firstly, you can collectivize the struggle. So if nothing else, instead of asking the question, what can I do to show solidarity with Palestinians and Palestine Action, we can instead ask the question, what can we do? And what that means practically is messaging people. When we get off this call, we message people who you trust and say, what do we do? What do we do to show practical solidarity to Palestine Action and the Palestinians? So secondly, in that regard, like how do we collectivize our response to this attempt to suppress Palestine Action? You can speak specifically to organizations. You can speak to your trade union, see if they can put out a statement, see if they can do something, lobby their MP, whatever it might be. And if you're not a member of a trade union, then you can use this as a pretext for joining and finding other comrades in the union who are concerned about Palestine solidarity in general, and solidarity with Palestine Action in particular. And you can also then try to use the political process such as it is. I'm not a massive believer in what passes for British democracy. I don't think it's a democracy. It's a dictatorship of capital. But broadly, there are some steam valves in that dictatorship, and you can speak to your MP, you can speak to local councillors and try and not talk not just about this outrageous affront to democracy that Yvette Cooper has just announced today, right? This attempt to prescribe Palestine Action, but you can also talk about the Hamas application that I mentioned previously. Now, you should do it carefully. You should make clear, I do not support the organization itself because I'm aware that that's a crime, but I do support this application. And you can go to hamascase.com to read all of the documents in that case and familiarize yourself with the arguments and make the case as publicly as you feel comfortable doing for why, if you actually want peace, you have to talk to people who win elections. And finally, I would say that it's important to remember that you can express yourself and you can express your solidarity with Palestine Action without committing a crime until the moment that the decision comes into effect. If it does come into effect, right? It might not. It is being challenged both politically and possibly legally. But if you're willing to stick your head above the parapet now, you can simply say on social media or wherever you see fit, you know, we're all Palestine Action. They have that infographic that's doing around. You can just stand up and be counted and say, well, in my opinion, Palestine Action are the cutting edge of Palestine solidarity in this country. They will be remembered as heroes. And as far as I'm concerned, I already know that they're heroes. And I stand with them. I stand in unflinching solidarity with them at this moment when the British state is participating in the mass murder of Palestinians because they're not Jewish, sees fit to lecture anyone on how to resist colonialism. So you can do that. And if you get into trouble for doing that, then the left in this country is getting increasingly good at making sure that comrades get legal representation when they need it. So I've taken up too much of your time already, and I'm grateful to you all for listening to what I think about this stuff. What I would say is, I sort of started by talking about empathy and feelings and stuff. Like, it's okay to be afraid. It's scary. It's authoritarian, like this authoritarian pathetic Starmer government. It's this weird mix of like supply teacher energy. So he's like very, very boring and charmless individual, and yet he's doing this extremely authoritarian stuff and trying to outflank the Tories on the right at a moment when the Tories are manifesting in an increasingly fascist guise, right? Generic and co just coming out with this openly fascist stuff, attacking lawyers and judges, attacking immigrants. So it's okay to be scared. Like, it's terrifying, right? Islamophobia is on the rise, fascism is on the rise, and now this bootlicker Starmer is trying to, his government is trying to make Palestine Action illegal. It's okay to be afraid of that. I'm here to suggest that we got to face our fear, man. Like, the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. We can't let the Zionists win. Like, they're doing a genocide. We must never become numb to the fact that this is a genocide. And we must find ways to stand in solidarity with Palestinians because we owe it to them, but we owe it to ourselves as human. Humans are disgusted by Zionism, and we need to stand up against it. We will win together. And as we say where I come from, Chucky Allah, like, our day will come. That must be true. Our day will come. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brent. I suppose a couple of things on that, because it was a lot of information to pack in, and I'm sure that we'll have this in little snippets in terms of your call for action and everything else. But one thing that was really important as well, I suppose, is we're seeing the kind of irony of some of these particular points as well, because we have Keir Starmer, who was himself defending a very similar action in 2004. There was an actual legal case in which a very similar situation happened, and in which effectively he defended that, and we see a complete change, a complete 180 in relation to what he's been doing. So everything that you've been saying about this seems to follow through in terms of there is evidence and precedent for what exactly has been going on.
Yeah, he's a liar, and he has no integrity, and everyone knows that. Like, even his like right-wing opponents see that about him. Like, you can't trust a word comes out of his mouth. Like, as a lawyer, he must have understood how credibility works, and maybe he had some integrity when he practiced at the bar. But since then, his integrity has completely collapsed, and everyone will remember him for being a liar, a racist, and a war criminal.
Indeed. I suppose one thing I will say is there has been some positives. I know that there was a legal decision that you undertook recently, and basically what you were talking about in terms of the unitary state, I mean, that used to be something that people really feared, but calling for the abolition of Israel and its replacement with a unitary state comprising of Jewish and Palestinian citizens is something we can say now because of some of the cases that we've taken forward, highlighting the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba upon Israel and the way in which it was constructed. That's also
absolutely. You're talking about the High Court case of Hussein and SRA, and what I mean, it's a really important judgment, I think. And what's really staggering, I think, is the way that we argued it, you'll remember, was to say, well, look, Israel's currently governed by fascists. The Bezalel Smotrich is the finance minister. He tells us he's a fascist. It cannot be anti-Semitic to report the speech of actual sitting Israeli ministers. And it must follow that saying Israel is governed by fascists is not anti-Semitic. And from there, it follows that we're allowed to try to understand how this literal fascist regime will operate by comparing it to the actions of historical and contemporary fascist regimes. And from there, it's a short hop to say, Nazi Germany is the most well-known example of a fascist regime. And so without more, and there is a part of the judgment that, of course, says, look, it's possible to use the allegation of Nazi comparison as a sort of taunt to attack Jews. But without more, it is legitimate to compare the actions of the Israeli government. You know, people use words like Lebensraum and Untermenschen. It's like, look, that might be spicy, but without more, if Israel, so-called, didn't want to meet with these fascist comparisons, it shouldn't have elected fascists, and it shouldn't act in a fascist way, including by enacting a genocide. So it seems like the IHRA definition is collapsing. The English High Court's support for the ethno-state of Israel is collapsing. It's open season on Zionism. We just have to be courageous and keep going, because it really feels like this is the terminal crisis of Zionism. But you know, it's not going down without a fight, and that's why, predictably, its allies in the British Empire are doing so much to suppress Palestine solidarity. That's all. That's just another sign that we're winning. That's my opinion.
I think that was the point, isn't it? To just basically let people know and let people understand there are victories through lawfare itself, I suppose, that are happening, that are changing the position that people once thought they weren't allowed to kind of put forward because of fear. And I think that is the most important thing that you brought out here, is that, you know, don't be afraid. And on that point of not being afraid, I'm just going to ask all of our panelists to give a final point before we head off and close this chapter. But Frank, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really insightful. I'm sure many people have got a lot from it. If I can first come to you, Saeed, in terms of not being afraid, in terms of what you've been doing, what would you have to say about that as a final thought? Sorry, you're on mute.
I say it's an amazingly empowering feeling to take action. I don't mean the high level stuff where you have to, you know, get arrested. Please do look at some of the BDS supermarket actions. They'll go into a supermarket, disrupt the sale of Israeli goods. It's totally legal as long as you don't damage anything. To fight colonialism and capitalism, I think it has to be done with legal, non-arrestable direct action. Get down to the arms fairs where BAE are. They're trying to sell arms for a genocide. Go there, stand next to them. Just start talking about what they do. Blood money, profiteering. Perfectly legal for people to stand in front of a war factory that, you know, is supplying Israel, and perfectly legal to stand there until the police issue a Section 14. Then just leave, guys, because then the police have the power to move us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. Sorry, thank you, Saeed. Ahmed, your final thoughts in relation to, you know, this point?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with everything that was being said there. What I would add is that this isn't a time for fatigue. Many people feel that. It's a time to actually double down. Zionism is weak, and it's weaker now than it has ever been. Its internal contradictions are rising to the fore. There's there's something of a civil war emerging within the state. And it's time for people to be more organized, to be more resilient, and to remember that any difficulties, any struggles that we face, any fears that people may feel for putting their neck on the line is nothing compared to the immense suffering of our brothers and sisters in Gaza. We have to remember that. And we also have to remember that change, real meaningful change, happens when people actually put themselves on the line. There's a lot of action I see, but it's happening in safe zones. People are unwilling to make the sacrifice to actually put themselves on the line. And for change to happen meaningfully, that needs to happen in a collective fashion. So I think this is really a time for everyone to actually really collectively rise up and use whatever avenue is available to us to actually keep pushing, keep moving, keep pushing the needle. It all has an impact, whether that's on social media, whether that's with the boycotts and the coordination in that, whether it's speaking truth in a public domain, whether it's raising it in your workplace or in your education facilities or wherever it may be. This is the moment, and we need to really seize that.
Thank you for that, Ahmed. And Anas, I'll leave the final word to you in relation to this. But thank you again, Ahmed, for those comments. Anas, what do you think? You're on mute.
Yeah, it's very difficult to top what's already been said by Ahmed, by Sayed, by Frank especially. But I guess what I would say is that what we're seeing today is a culmination of decades of perhaps reluctance from communities to act, to respond adequately to the challenges that are before us. And I guess if there's any silver lining from what's happening right now around us, is that Gaza has put everything into perspective, and it's made us realize that we have to take action. You know, there's no space for fear anymore. There's no space for rationalizing our invisibility, really, and framing it as some sort of strategic action. This is the time to be present. This is the time to be public. This is the time to express our solidarity, and it's that time to push the envelope as far as we can. As we are seeing a genocide happening before us, all red lines have been broken essentially, and we cannot no longer work with the same rules of the game. We need to rewrite the rules.
And as Saeed, Frank, Ahmed, Noor, and obviously Dr. Azam and Frank, thank you so much for your time today. I think we're going to wrap it there because it's been such an interesting talk, but it's also been so enlightening. And the fact that we've been able to give people also a call to action on all of these points at this very critical juncture has been absolutely amazing as well. So at least people can walk away from this and not just say, oh, it's a talk, but take something from it to say, what can we do next? Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Thank you very much for all of your attendance, and goodbye.